London in 1868 was a city of sharp contrasts. Gas lamps threw a yellow glow on cobblestone streets slick with rain, their light touching both the polished boots of gentlemen and the torn shoes of beggars. The air carried the sound of carriage wheels clattering over stone, mingling with the cries of vendors in markets where fish still smelled of the river, and smoke from countless chimneys hung low, making everything seem dim and tired. Behind the brick facades of tall row houses, secrets lived in silence, hidden in narrow rooms and locked drawers. It was in one of these houses on a street that most people walked past without notice that a story would begin to unfold, unsettling not just the neighbors but also doctors, priests, and even newspapers across the country. The house itself gave little away. Modest but well kept, with iron railings along the steps and curtains drawn tight, it looked like hundreds of others in the district. To those who knew the family inside, nothing seemed out of place. The father, a man of stiff manners and fixed routines, kept his household strict but respectable. The mother, worn down but still graceful, moved quietly through her days with the patience of someone who carried more worry than she ever admitted. And then there was their daughter, a pale figure who seemed both part of this world and somehow set apart from it. She was watched closely and whispered about even more. To some, she appeared delicate, almost saintly, but to others, there was something in her stillness that unsettled them. Neighbors often noticed the light in her room burning long after the rest of the street had gone dark. At first, they thought little of it. Many young women kept irregular hours, either reading or sewing. But soon it became clear this was no ordinary habit. She was awake at times when no one should be. Awake not just through the night, but through. Every night, her face drawn yet oddly calm, her eyes wide open as if she had forgotten what sleep was. Rumors grew quietly at first. Some said she was possessed. Others whispered she was cursed. A few thought it was simply a trick, an exaggeration by her parents to keep her watched over. But as months passed, the gossip turned into concern and then into fear. The family rarely spoke of it. Outwardly, they tried to keep their lives steady. The father went about his business with a stern expression that dared anyone to question him. The mother, softer, often carried the weight of other people's pity, though she deflected it with polite smiles. Within their walls, however, tension thickened like smoke. Visitors described the house as too quiet, every sound echoing louder than it should, as if the family lived in constant waiting. Doctors came, men in black coats carrying bags of instruments and papers, their voices hushed as they took notes and whispered to one another. They studied her, asked endless questions, and left with more doubt than answers. Sleep was supposed to be nature's law, a force no one could escape. Yet here was a young girl who seemed untouched by it. Each physician left puzzled, some unsettled, a few perhaps even thrilled at the chance to attach their name to a mystery no one else could explain. Still, life outside the house carried on. Carriages clattered past, neighbors called to one another, and children played in the streets, their laughter carrying faintly through the closed curtains. The family tried to appear normal in this world that was always watching, but the truth was that they had become prisoners of their own secret. Behind those walls, the girl's sleeplessness was not just a curiosity. It was a burden, stretching the limits of her strength, and theirs as well. There were nights when her mother sat beside her, candlelight flickering across her tired face, humming softly in the hope that her daughter might finally rest. There were mornings when her father's temper snapped at the smallest things, as though the constant strain had worn away at the edges of his discipline. And there were moments when the girl herself, pale and thin, seemed caught between two worlds, her eyes fixed on something no one else could see. The unease began to creep outward. Neighbors who once knocked politely now avoided the steps altogether. Servants who had worked for the family found excuses to leave. Even relatives came less often, their visits shorter each time, as if they too felt the air of something unnatural pressing down inside that house. By 1868, whispers had moved beyond the street and into the city, drawing the attention of journalists who loved nothing more than a tale that blurred the line between science and the supernatural. On the surface, it seemed like nothing more than a strange medical case, one that puzzled physicians and intrigued gossip. But beneath the quiet facade of that home, deeper troubles stirred. Power shifted in small ways. Between a father desperate to maintain control, a mother trapped between love and despair, and a girl who seemed both victim and unwilling participant in her own unraveling. In that fragile balance, darker truths waited to surface, truths that would challenge not just medicine, but the morality of those who claimed to know what was best for her. It was still, for now, only whispers in shadowed streets and nervous glances behind closed curtains. But already, the fragile walls around the family were beginning to crack. Something was coming, and though no one could yet name it, everyone could feel it pressing closer, night after night, as the girl who never slept sat awake in her room, staring into the darkness while the rest of the city dreamed. That be why the start of that year. The household had already shifted into something far more fragile than it appeared from the outside. The girl's sleeplessness was no longer a secret contained within the family's walls. It had become a kind of silent spectacle, an unspoken weight that followed them wherever they went. The father walked the streets with an even stiffer posture than before, daring anyone to speak of his daughter. The mother, though outwardly polite, grew thinner, her face showing the strain of nights spent awake beside a child who never closed her eyes. Their daughter herself seemed caught in the middle of all this, strangely calm at times, but with a look in her eyes that unsettled even those who pitied her. She was never entirely there, as though part of her was always listening to something no one else could hear. It was around this time that jealousy and suspicion began to creep in. The father's pride could not bear the constant attention drawn by his daughter's condition. Neighbors whispered not about his business or his standing, but about the strange child who lived under his roof. Every new doctor who visited, every clergyman who called, made him feel exposed, judged, as if the family's respectability hung by a thread. He began to lash out more, his anger falling on his wife for entertaining too many questions, on the girl for being the source of their disgrace, and even on servants who whispered behind closed doors. His voice grew sharper, his patience shorter, and in his eyes, control became the only weapon he had left. The mother carried her own secret grief. In quiet moments, when no one was watching, she would take her daughter's hand and hold it tightly, almost as if to reassure herself that the girl was still real, still alive. But she also carried doubts that she could never say aloud. What if the girl's sleeplessness was not natural? What if it was punishment, a mark placed on their family for sins spoken and unspoken? She went to the church often, kneeling longer than most, though prayer gave her little peace. At times, she would glance at her husband, rigid and unbending, and wonder if he knew more than he admitted. The girl herself began to show signs of strain. Though she never slept, she grew thinner, her skin almost translucent under the dim light of candles. She smiled rarely, and when she did, it unsettled those who saw it. It was never the soft smile of a child, but something colder, almost detached, as if she smiled not at them, but at something behind them. Her eyes, too, seemed to change. They grew sharper, more watchful, and there were times she spoke words that sounded too heavy, too knowing for her age. It was in those moments that even her mother shivered, as though her child were slipping further into some unknown place. Doctors came more frequently, each hoping to succeed where others had failed. They examined her pulse, her eyes, her mind. Some suggested a hidden illness. Others spoke of hysteria or a nervous disorder. A few whispered of trickery, implying that the girl and her family were part of some elaborate deception for attention or money. These accusations cut deeply, especially for the father, who saw them as attacks on his honor. He turned colder, refusing to answer questions and dismissing doctors as fools who sought fame at his family's expense. Yet behind his back, he read their notes obsessively, searching for explanations he would never admit he needed. External pressures grew heavy. Money, once comfortable, began to slip away. Endless consultations with physicians, donations to the church for prayers, the quiet costs of maintaining a reputation. They all drained the family savings. Servants were dismissed one by one until only a single maid remained. A young woman who stayed, not out of loyalty, but because she had nowhere else to go. This shrinking household only deepened the isolation, leaving the family to face one another more directly, with no one left to absorb the sharpness of their words. The mother's relatives, though they visited from time to time, began to withdraw. They whispered their concerns, but offered little help. Some believed the girl's sleeplessness was an invention of her parents, perhaps to hide some darker truth. Others believed the girl herself was dangerous. A cousin, after one visit, swore he had seen her eyes fixed on him in the dark, unblinking, until he left the room trembling. The family, once surrounded by social ties, now found themselves shunned, as if their misfortune carried a contagion that others feared would spread. The girl's condition became a stage for power struggles inside the house. The father demanded obedience, ordering her to behave normally, to eat when he told her, and to stay in her room at certain hours. He refused to admit weakness and forbade his wife from speaking of the sleeplessness outside their home. But the mother could not obey in silence. She confided small details to a priest, whose visits grew more frequent, his eyes heavy with suspicion that something beyond medicine might be at work. The father loathed these visits, seeing them as a challenge to his authority, while the mother clung to them as her only hope. The girl herself seemed to understand these tensions. She began to test them, speaking softly in ways that unsettled her parents. To her father, she once said, "I know what you do when you leave us at night," though she could never have followed him. To her mother, she whispered, "You are afraid of me, aren't you?" as if she could see straight into her heart. These words were not shouted, not dramatic, but they left both parents shaken. It was as though their daughter had found the cracks in their defenses and pressed her fingers against them. At the same time, darker stories from the past began to resurface. The mother carried with her the memory of another child, one lost in infancy years before. She rarely spoke of it, but at night she wondered if this strange sleeplessness was tied to that loss, if some curse had settled on her womb and now lived in the child who survived. The father, for his part, held on to secrets of debts and failed ventures, things he had hidden from his wife to protect his pride. But in the strain of the sleepless household, these secrets began to weigh heavily, pushing his temper closer to breaking. The maid, young and fearful, became another thread in the growing web. She confessed once to her mother that she often heard the girl pacing the halls at night, whispering to herself as though speaking to someone unseen. When asked what the whispers sounded like, the maid shook her head and refused to say more. Within weeks, she began looking for other work, though few were willing to hire someone who came from a household so steeped in rumor. Her unease, however, only added fuel to the whispers outside. The press, sensing a story that blended science, faith, and fear, began to knock at the door. Though the father slammed it shut each time, the newspapers carried half-truths and speculation. They painted the girl as a miracle, a fraud, or monst. Depending on the writer. The mother wept when she read them, while the father raged, and the girl herself sat silently, her face unreadable, as if she neither cared nor recognized herself in their word. As spring turned to summer, the atmosphere in the house grew more stifling. Heat clung to the walls, and tempers flared more easily. The girl, still sleepless, began refusing meals, pushing away plates with an absent look. Her body grew weaker, but her eyes stayed sharp, fixed on the corners of the room where no one else saw anything. The mother begged her to eat, to speak, to rest, but the girl's replies were often strange. "I am resting," she said once. "I rest while I watch." The father grew more controlling. As if by sheer force, he could will his household back into order. He locked doors at night, ordered his wife to stop her confessions to the priest, and struck the table when she defied him. His authority, once unshaken, now seemed desperate, a mask covering his own fear. The mother, exhausted and frightened, began to resist in quiet ways, slipping notes to the priest, hiding money in small bundles, preparing for an escape she could not yet admit even to herself. The girl remained at the center of it all, untouched by sleep, watching her parents tear each other apart under the weight of her condition. Sometimes she seemed cruel, almost enjoying the cracks widening between them. Other times she looked terribly sad, as if she too longed for rest but no longer remembered how. It was in those moments that the mother's heart broke most, torn between pity and fear. What began as a strange medical mystery had turned into something darker, a battle of control, of faith, of survival within a house where no one trusted the other fully anymore. And as the tension deepened, as nights stretched longer and the girl's sleepless gaze grew colder, it was clear that the fragile threads holding the family together were close to snapping. The city outside continued its busy rhythm, but inside that modest house, the storm was gathering and the breaking point was drawing near. The summer heat had lingered late into September, making the air inside the house heavy, suffocating. Curtains stayed drawn, trapping the warmth, and with every passing day, the room seemed more like a cage than a home. The family was unraveling fast, each thread snapping one by one. The father prowled the halls with a tight jaw and restless hands. The mother moved like a shadow, hollowed out from endless nights, and the sleepless girl, paler than ever, yet watchful, sat in silence, as if waiting for something only she knew would come. That night began like so many others, with the father demanding order. He had locked the doors again, muttering about keeping reporters and neighbors out, though it was clear the locks were meant for those within as much as those without. The maid had gone, leaving only the family trapped together in their stifling house. Dinner sat untouched on the table, candles burning low, wax dripping down to stain the wood. The girl pushed her plate away without a word, her hands folded in her lap. Her mother begged her softly to eat, her voice breaking. The father slammed his fist against the table so hard the dishes rattled, shouting that enough was enough, that this would end tonight. The girl lifted her head then, meeting his eyes. "I do not sleep because I see what you pretend to hide," she said, her voice calm, too calm for the moment. The words lie, dead like stones. The father's face went red, his breath quickening. He demanded she stop, demanded she respect him. But she did not blink, did not flinch. "You fear me," she added, her tone almost curious. "You fear what I know." The mother, pale and shaking, reached across the table, trying to quiet her, trying to calm her husband, but it was too late. Something in the father broke. For weeks, months, maybe years, he had been holding back the weight of shame, anger, humiliation, and fear. Now it surged forward in one violent rush. He rose suddenly, his chair scraping back with a screech, his hand closing around the heavy candlestick that had burned low on the table. The mother screamed his name, begged him to stop, but he didn't hear. Or perhaps he chose not to. His rage, fueled by months of feeling powerless in his own home, blinded him. He brought the candlestick down once, the metal striking his daughter's shoulder, sending her thin body twisting sideways. She didn't cry out. She only looked at him, eyes wide, almost calm still, which enraged him more. He struck again, this time across her head, and the sound was sickening, dull, final. The room seemed to freeze in that moment. The mother's scream tore through the silence, her chair tipping as she rushed forward to her daughter. The candlestick clattered from the father's hand onto the table, rolling, knocking over a plate. He stood there trembling, his chest heaving, staring at what he had done. The girl slumped against her mother, blood running down the side of her face, her pale skin now marked with brutal red. Her eyes fluttered once, then closed, the first time in years they had closed, and she did not open them again. The father staggered back, his lips moving but no words coming. His rage had burned out in an instant, leaving only shock and horror. He pressed his hands to his head, muttering that it wasn't supposed to be this way, that she had pushed him, that she had forced him to it. He tried to convince himself, even as the truth stared back at him. He had killed her. The mother cradled the girl's body, rocking back and forth on the floor, her cries raw and broken. She whispered her daughter's name over and over, as if calling it might bring her back. Her dress grew stained with blood, but she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, her mind refusing to accept what had happened. She turned to her husband, screaming that he had damned them all, that the curse he feared was now real because of his own hands. The father dropped to his knees, crawling toward them, reaching out with trembling hands. He begged her to stop shouting, begged her to listen. He said they could still fix this, that no one needed to know. His voice cracked, frantic, wild. He spoke of doctors, of explanations, of covering the truth. His words spilled over each other, desperate to rewrite what had just happened, but nothing could erase the blood pooling on the floor, the silence where the girl's watchful breathing had once filled the night. The house felt alive with panic. Every sound, the drip of wax, the tick of the clock, the sobs of the mother, echoed too loud, too sharp. The father's mind raced, already twisting toward denial. He ranted that it was her fault, that she had provoked him, that she had been unnatural from the beginning. He told himself and his wife that this was not murder but release, that he had freed her from the curse. His voice shook, but he clung to the story, needing it to be true because the reality was too monstrous to face. The mother, clutching the still body of her siege. Al could not hear him. She rocked and wept, her cries rising and falling like waves. At one point, she looked down at her daughter's face, her closed eyes, and whispered through her tears, "At last she rests." The words were both a sorrow and a cruel kind of comfort. For the first time since her birth, their daughter slept, but it was the eternal sleep the mother had feared all along. The father scrambled to his feet, pacing, muttering. He spoke of burying her quickly, of telling neighbors she had fallen ill, of keeping the name of the family intact. His pride, even now, outweighed his grief. He was already building a wall of lies to protect himself, already twisting the story into one where he remained in control. He tried to pull his wife from the floor, but she clung to her daughter with a strength he could not break. Her eyes met his then, and for the first time, there was nothing soft left in them, only hatred. The night stretched long, filled with the sound of her weeping and his muttering. The house, which had been a prison for months, now felt like a tomb. Every corner seemed darker, every shadow heavier. Outside, the city carried on in ignorance, carriages passing, voices drifting, while inside one family had been shattered by violence born of fear and pride. B.Y. Dawn. The father's face was pale, his hands shaking as he tried to clean the blood from the floor, from the table, from the candlestick that had become a weapon. He worked feverishly, muttering prayers and curses, desperate to erase what could not be undone. The mother sat unmoving, her daughter's body still in her arms, her eyes empty, fixed on nothing. In those early hours, both of them knew there would be no escape, but each clung to their own denial. He to his lies, she to her grief. The crime had broken them, torn away the fragile masks they had worn for so long. There was no mystery left, no medical puzzle for doctors to argue over. The sleepless girl had finally closed her eyes, not by nature or miracle, but by violence in the very home that was meant to protect her. And in that single night, everything that had been strange and whispered about turned into tragedy too brutal to ignore. Morning light crept slowly into the house, pale and cold, as if the sun itself recoiled from what had been done inside. The air was heavy with the smell of iron and candle wax, a reminder of the night that had torn everything apart. The girl's body had been moved at last, laid out on her small bed, her face clean of blood but still marked by the violence that ended her life. Her eyes were closed, and for anyone who didn't know better, she might have looked like she had finally drifted into the sleep she had been denied her entire short life. The father refused to look at her. He spent the morning scrubbing the floor, polishing the candlestick until his hands were raw, muttering that no one must ever know. His words came sharp and fast, like a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. He told himself and his wife that what had happened was necessary, that it had been a moment of madness, a release of something unnatural. He repeated it until it sounded almost convincing to his own ears, but the cracks in his voice betrayed the truth. Beneath the thin mask of control, guilt gnawed at him like a slow, relentless fire. The mother did not argue. She sat at the girl's bedside, her face pale, her body rigid, her hands folded tightly over her lap as though she was holding herself together piece by piece. She did not cry anymore. The tears had run out in the night. What remained was a silence, so deep it unsettled even the father. She answered his frantic mutterings with no thing but the faintest shake of her head, or the kind of stillness that said she no longer believed any words could matter. Her grief had hollowed her, and the weight of it pressed so heavily that she seemed less alive than she had been the day before. News spread quickly, as it always did. At first, the family tried to keep it quiet, telling neighbors the girl had finally succumbed to illness. But whispers had already circulated for months about the sleepless child, and when people heard she had died suddenly, questions followed. Some claimed it was expected that nobody could survive without rest. Others muttered darker things, that the family had done something to her, that the sleepless girl's strange presence had always carried the scent of tragedy. The newspapers seized on the story, their words turning grief into spectacle. They wrote of the ghost-like child of London and the mystery of her sleepless nights, speculating wildly on what had finally ended her life. Some painted her as a medical marvel, others as an omen, and a few dared to suggest that her family had played a role in her death. The father raged when he read these accounts, hurling papers into the fire, but their words were already in print, spreading across the city, reshaping his family's name in ways he could not control. The community's reaction cut deepest of all. Where once people had crossed the street to avoid the family out of fear, now they did so out of suspicion. The mother, when she ventured outside, felt their stares following her, whispers swirling behind her back. Sympathy was scarce. Curiosity and judgment were far stronger. For all her quiet suffering, she was now a woman marked by tragedy, her grief a spectacle that others picked apart in hushed conversations. The father faced even harsher judgment. His stern demeanor, once respected, now looked like cruelty. Rumors grew sharper, suggesting he had struck the final blow. Though nothing was proven, suspicion clung to him like a second skin. Inside the house, the toll deepened. Nights were longer than ever. The silence with the girl's restless pacing had once been was unbearable, a void that echoed louder than sound. The mother often sat in her daughter's empty room, staring at the untouched belongings, her mind circling the same thought, that she had failed to protect her child. She remembered every whispered warning from her daughter, every unsettling smile, every time she had brushed aside her own fear. Now those moments haunted her, twisting into the belief that she might have seen this ending all along and done nothing to stop it. Guilt consumed her, pulling her further into isolation. The father coped in his own way, clinging to denial. He convinced himself it had been an accident, or that the girl herself had forced it upon him with her strange words and unblinking eyes. At times, he even spoke as though she had never truly been his daughter, but some kind of burden sent to test him. These justifications kept him upright, but at a cost. His mind frayed at the edges, paranoia creeping in. He accused neighbors of watching the house too closely, swore that doctors were plotting to accuse him of murder, and grew violent when his wife contradicted him. The more he spoke of control, the less of it he seemed to have. Relatives who had once kept their distance now returned, drawn less by love than by the scandal. They asked sharp questions, their eyes lingering on the father why. Suspicion. Some urged the mother to leave him, to escape before more harm came. But she did not move, bound by a mixture of fear, grief, and the strange, bitter loyalty that comes from surviving tragedy together. The family name, once something the father guarded fiercely, was now stained, and every attempt to polish it only deepened the cracks. The authorities eventually became involved. A doctor summoned by relatives examined the girl's body and found injuries too severe to be ignored. An inquiry followed, and though the father insisted she had collapsed in a fit, the truth could not be fully hidden. The blow to her head was impossible to explain away. Neighbors testified to hearing shouting the night she died, and though no trial came immediately, The shadow of the law fell heavily over the house. The father's denial grew louder, more desperate, while the mother sank further into silence, her voice almost gone. The community's judgment hardened. Once a family of respectability, they were now a cautionary tale, their house pointed at by children daring one another to walk past. The girl's story, told and retold, twisted into something far from the truth. Some said she had been a saint, others a devil, but in every version, the family was condemned. What had once been whispered pity became open scorn, and the family was left with no friends, no allies, only the memory of the child they had lost and the violence that had taken her. The personal toll was deepest of all. The mother, carrying unbearable guilt, began to waste away, her health failing under the weight of grief. She visited her daughter's grave daily, sometimes speaking aloud to her, as if she were only sleeping. The father, meanwhile, grew more unsteady, swinging between bursts of anger and moments of haunted silence. At night, he swore he heard footsteps in halls, the same restless pacing that had NCE belonged to the sleepless girl. Sometimes he called out her name in the dark, demanding she show herself, as if even in death she had the power to unnerve him. The house itself decayed. Without servants to maintain it, dust gathered, curtains sagged, and the once orderly rooms grew cluttered and dim. The space that had once been a prison for their daughter became a prison for them, filled with echoes of the past and shadows they could not escape. The crime had not only taken the girl's life, it had hollowed out the lives of everyone left behind, leaving only ruin where once there had been the pretense of order. By the end of that year, the family was a shell of what it had been. The father clung to denial, his pride cracking under the strain. The mother withered under grief, and the community turned its back on them entirely. The crime had stripped away everything: their reputation, their security, their hope. What remained was a legacy of whispers and suspicion, the story of a girl who never slept and the violence that finally silenced her. The trial of Charles Wyndham drew enormous crowds, not only from London, but from across the country. Newspapers printed every word of testimony, every dramatic pause, and every whispered speculation. Some saw him as a calculating murderer who preyed upon a frail woman for his own ambition, while others pitted him as a desperate man driven to madness by the weight of duty and the twisted love he bore for Lydia. The courtroom itself became more like a stage than a place of justice, with barristers delivering speeches that read like theater scripts and reporters shaping narratives that would live on long after the verdict. When the guilty verdict was announced, silence fell over the room. Charles stood motionless, his once confident presence diminished to a ghost of what it had been. He did not cry out, nor did he argue. Instead, he closed his eyes as if he had long expected this end. The sentence was clear: death by hanging. Yet even as the judge's words echoed, many wondered if justice had he truly been served. Was he a monster beyond redemption, or a man broken by the pressures of his time? The answer, it seemed, depended on who was asked it. Lydia's body, frail and wasted, was laid to rest in a quiet cemetery outside London. Few attended her funeral beyond her family and a handful of sympathetic doctors who still debated whether her sleeplessness had been a strange medical mystery or a sign of manipulation from Charles. Her grave quickly became a site of morbid fascination. Curious onlookers visited, whispering stories of the girl who never slept, some swearing they felt a strange chill in the air or saw her likeness in the shadows at dusk. In death, Lydia remained a figure of mystery, her suffering neither fully understood nor fairly explained. For the Wyndham family, the consequences stretched far beyond the courtroom. Their name, once synonymous with respectability, became a stain whispered about in drawing rooms and alleyways alike. Investors withdrew from Charles's business ventures, friends turned cold, and even distant relatives distanced themselves from the scandal. His wealth dwindled, and what remained went toward paying legal fees and debts. His family bore the weight of shame, living in the long shadow of his crime. Society, too, was forced to confront uncomfortable truths. The case raised questions about the role of medical science, about how far a physician should go in the name of treatment, and whether ambition could ever excuse cruelty. Many began to reconsider the unchecked authority doctors held over vulnerable patients. The scandal forced Parliament to revisit laws surrounding medical experiments and patient rights, though change came slowly. At the same time, it sparked debates about marriage control and the hidden violence that could exist behind respectable doors. What lingered most, however, was the haunting tale of a young woman who had lived her life under constant observation, stripped of rest, stripped of agency, and finally stripped of her future. Some saw her as a victim of her husband's greed, others as a tragic figure trapped in a society that valued appearances over compassion. Whatever the interpretation, Lydia's story became a cautionary tale, one retold in pamphlets, sermons, and drawing room gossip. Parents warned their daughters to beware the charm of ambitious men, and physicians whispered nervously about the line between healing and harm. As for Charles, his final days in Newgate prison were marked by quiet resignation. Visitors reported that he spoke little, often staring at the walls as though already gone from the world. In one letter to his sister, he admitted that he had loved Lydia in his own way, but that his pride and hunger for recognition had twisted that love into something cruel. He did not ask for forgiveness, only that his name not be forgotten. Whether he was remembered as a villain or a victim, no one could say on the morning of his execution. The sky hung heavy with fog. Crowds gathered, as they always did, eager to see the fall of a man once so admired. Charles walked to the gallows with a dignity that unnerved some and impressed others. When a noose was placed around his neck, he lifted his eyes, not to the heavens, but to the sea of faces watching, as if daring them to remember him however they wished. A moment later, it was over. The story did not end with the hangman's rope. Decades later, writers and scholars continued to argue over the case. Was Charles a murderer or a tragic figure caught in the cruel machinery of Victorian expectations? Was Lydia a victim of her husband's control, or of a society that ignored the suffering of women in the name of science and duty? Each new telling shifted the blame, yet none could erase the horror of her last days. In the end, what remained was less about crime and punishment and more about the fragile boundaries of love, power, and morality. The tale of Lydia and Charles was not just a scandal of its time. It was a mirror held up to human nature, revealing the ease with which care can turn to control and love can be twisted by pride. Justice, if it ever came, was imperfect. The law delivered its verdict, but the deeper wounds, the silence, the shame, the unanswered questions, remained. And so, the girl who never slept lived on, not in peaceful rest, but in memory. Her story served as a reminder of how thin the veil is between tenderness and cruelty, between ambition and destruction, between love and possession. In that reminder lay the true legacy of her life and death, a haunting that no courtroom or execution could ever silence.